Thank you very much, Pia Oberoi, for participating in the Autumn Academy 2017 here in Oxford. And it was very inspiring today to hear your presentation on how the international legal framework and the international human rights law deals with the situation of irregular migrants. What were the key points of your presentation?
Thank you very much, and it was a pleasure to be here as well. I think the main point that I wanted to bring to the room was the fact that the International Human Rights Framework is a universal framework. So it applies to all people regardless of their status. And in the case of irregular migrants, that's quite an important point to make, because the widespread assumption is that because you are irregularly in a country without the permission, if you will, to be there, that means that there can be restrictions on your rights, whereas the International Legal Framework says very clearly, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says very clearly that everyone is entitled to all of the rights and freedoms that are set forth in that declaration. And similarly, the two covenants are very clear that their protection applies to everyone. So the question really is not so much, do rights apply, but how can governments then make good on their obligations to protect these rights? And the other point that I think I wanted to make quite strongly was that obviously the human rights framework is a minimum framework of rights. It's a well-developed and increasingly more developed framework of rights, but it does require grounding. It requires member states of the United Nations, states parties to the various conventions and covenants, to really think about what does it mean to make these rights a reality for the rights holders, in this case the irregular migrants.
And how do you see the international legal frameworks evolving with regard to the situation of irregular migrants? What do you think will be the necessary developments, or if there is no development that is needed on the international legal framework to improve the situation of irregular migrants?
Well, I think what I tried to say in my presentation is that you do have some measure of evolution within, let's say, the jurisprudence at the international level, the jurisprudence in this case being the guidance, for instance, of the treaty bodies and the other human rights mechanisms, where increasingly over the last few years there has been an attempt by the treaty bodies to really kind of give guidance to the states parties to their particular conventions on how they can operationalize the protections, for instance, under the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights or the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So there has, I think, really been an evolution, and particularly on the issue of irregular migrants, because I think if you go back to, for instance, let's say with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, General Comment number 6 of the committee, which looked at unaccompanied and separated children, but really the lens was very much that you would be traveling and moving within a refugee context, and the protections that would be needed for these children would be mainly within an asylum and refugee context. Increasingly, if you fast forward now to 2012, the conclusions of the Day of General Discussion of the CRC very much speak to the protections that are needed for children in irregular situations, children that may have been born in irregular situations and not necessarily just kind of arrived in a country, but really have known nothing but an irregular situation all their lives. So I think kind of keeping in a sense a pace with the developments that we see on the ground. Where I was less convinced about evolution, I have to say, is the way that the multilateral framework itself may deal with migration. And I tried to look through some of the recent developments at the intergovernmental level in relation to migration. And I mean, I think that we can see that there is some sort of an opening. For instance, the New York Declaration did mention human rights, including in relation to migrants, regardless of their status. So there is the possibility that there will be a forward momentum, but at the same time, and I think it's very important to be aware of the political context within which these negotiations are going to happen, and it's not particularly, let's say, favorable to the highest common denominator. And one of the things that I wanted to highlight as well was that we feel that the narrative, so the public kind of voice in relation to wanting to protect migrants more, is one of the key aspects to making better policy. I mean, when we talk to policymakers, one of the things that we're always told is, well, the public is not going to support XYZ human rights respecting measure. I think that it's important. We heard in the room today, about political leadership, which I think is one part of it. But more than that, in a way, it's about communities coming together to say, well, what kind of societies do we want to create? What kind of societies do we want our kids to live in, etc. And for me, like I said, I think that really speaks to the local level. It speaks to the level of the city, of the municipality, because that really is where people live. And while we can have big meta discussions about migration as, a proxy fear for the fact that I'm economically dislocated or globalization is leaving me behind, I think it's really at the level of where we live that governments can make decisions and really take leadership to say, well, no, undocumented children need to have access to education regardless of their status, and people that need medical care need to have access to that in a non-discriminatory manner. We need firewalls to protect people to be able to have this access to justice, etc. So I was very heartened to see that there's a focus on the local level in this discussion as well.
Thank you very much.
Not at all, thank you.